Okay.
Pretty good.
What was that?
They're pretty good.
Pretty good? You're
Yeah.
not feeling fatigued like Olivia and I are?
Not yet.
Well, kudos to you.
I do a lot of traveling, so I think that kind of helps.
Oh, where do you travel?
I go to New Mexico and then I just drive home. Like for the next 4 weekends, I have to drive home.
Okay, gotcha. Let's see. The furthest I've been away from home since, well, I guess I went to Texas during the summer, but that was mainly a research trip. So since July, I guess the furthest away I've been from home has been like Martin City.
Okay.
Which isn't that far away. How are the rest of you guys doing?
Good.
Olivia was mentioning that she's missing fall break, and I was telling her that I never really realized what that did for me during the course of a semester, but having a couple of days to breathe in the middle of things actually did make a difference, because I too am feeling the fatigue of just being on all the time. All right. The faculty council has asked me to read a statement to you, and these things always worry me for reasons that I can't quite articulate. But anyway, a message to read to all students from the William Jewell College faculty. It's a message from the faculty of William Jewell College to all the students in our classes. First of all, we want to say thank you for your efforts in keeping the campus safe and open during the fall semester so far. Your work in this regard and your willingness to deal with frustrations and annoyance of COVID-19 mitigation measures is appreciated. As we move into the winter season, where respected scientists tell us there is a strong possibility of increased risk and community spread of COVID, we want to take a moment to encourage you to continue the good work you've been doing to limit the spread of the virus. While we are all feeling the inevitable fatigue, Olivia and I at least, that results from being constantly diligent with regard to safety protocols, it is imperative that we not let our guard down and become lax in our standards where safety is concerned. Over the next few days, there will be a series of communications to remind us all of our responsibilities with regard to community safety, offering more details about the period of time after Thanksgiving break and beginning to outline our plans for the spring semester. Please keep an eye on your email and be sure to read carefully any information that is sent to you. As always, ask questions if you have them. We want everybody to be informed and be able to participate safely in our learning community. We on the faculty join you in hoping that in the spring we will begin to see the end of this pandemic. In the meantime, for all our sakes, we ask you to continue to wear masks, keep socially distanced, limit time in close proximity, and practice good hygiene, especially by frequently washing hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, and consider getting your flu shot. Thank you again for the good work you've been doing to keep us all safe. So that is the statement. It has been read. We haven't really talked much about COVID in this class because it isn't really concerned with food, although last spring we talked about COVID a lot in a number of our classes simply because students had questions. So I don't know what they're going to be sending you over the next couple of days and why they felt that it was necessary for us to be encouraging towards you in light of what's coming down the pike. I myself have offered opinions on what the spring semester should be like, but I don't know what the administration has decided yet. So I myself am in the dark as to what spring is going to be like in terms of whether we'll have spring break or not, when we will, if we do, when the semester is going to start, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm looking forward to actually seeing some official communication out of the administration about what the spring will hold. Do you guys have any questions about this since the administration has kind of brought up the topic here in class? Nobody?
Hey, well, I don't have a question, but I think
Yeah.
it just doesn't do the students any justice if we don't know what's going to be done for spring break. Like most colleges already know what they're going to do for the
Yeah.
spring, but like I just don't think our school is like doing it the proper way with letting us know what's going to go on for the spring.
Yeah, so there's been a conversation that's been going on at the administration level. I think since probably the beginning of the semester. I guess this was about 3 weeks ago. They surveyed faculty with I think 3 different plans as to how the spring semester could go. And I think after they received feedback from us, they've kind of finalized their plans. So let me just pull up an email. I closed my email so it doesn't go off during class, but let me open my email back up, because this morning when I got in, there was an email from the provost to faculty reminding us to read this thing that I just read to you. So in it, she says, I'll be sending messages to students with copies to faculty and staff today and tomorrow regarding Thanksgiving break and post-Thanksgiving information and changes to the spring 2021 semester. So I would guess that in the next 48 hours, you'll have something in your inbox as to what the plan is. I think what we've all been trying to do is trying to balance delivering an education that you feel like you're getting an education, while at the same time trying to keep as many people safe as possible. And doing that in a deliberative way sometimes takes more time than perhaps we would like. And so hopefully you'll have answers in the next 24 to 48 hours. Marcus, wherever. Oh, there you are, Marcus. Yeah, other questions? No, either you're fully fatigued or you've just kind of, come to terms with the current situation as it is. So anyway, that's that. Any questions over what we were covering last time? Okay, I kind of gone down the path of 20th century history as it relates to agriculture. And I realized that I kind of got ahead of myself because I was already in the Great Depression and I had skipped over some important things that happened before the Great Depression. So I paused and backed up and went back to 1897. And so I've recreated some of what was on the board last time and have added a couple of things to it. But we had talked about 1897, Fritz Haber inventing industrial fixation. This was used by farmers as fertilizers in the early part of the 20th century, but then this also could be repurposed in the production of munitions, gunpowder in particular. And then we talked about World War I erupting in Europe in 1914 and going until 1918. The United States was largely not a part of that war until the very end of that war. But we were basically talking about how this development of nitrogen fixation allowed World War I to become a much larger conflict than it might have been back in the 1800s, simply because of the availability of ammonium nitrate. And the last question that I asked you before we left was, where did we get ammonium nitrate before we had nitrogen fixation as a source of ammonium nitrate? I asked you guys to go and see if you could find the answer to that. Did any of you guys ever watch the old Star Trek? The old Star Trek with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy as Spock and those guys? The old series that was from the 1960s? Oh my gosh, you guys have never watched those things. Well, there's this one episode of Star Trek where Captain Kirk is stranded on this planet with this reptilian lizard that pretty much just hissed and grunted a lot. And he was locked in mortal combat with this much stronger adversary. But while the reptilian monster was very strong, he was actually not very bright. And as it turns out, Kirk found himself on a planet with a lot of minerals, a lot of mineral deposits, and it occurred to him mid-fight when he was getting his butt kicked that he could reason his way to prevail over this reptilian monster. And the crew of the Enterprise was watching him through the magic of long-range television, evidently, was watching him, and he started scurrying around for things and started putting them into this hollow log. And it occurred to them what he was doing, which was he was basically gathering up the raw materials that are needed for making gunpowder. And so traditionally, where we've gotten many of our nutrients, things like ammonium nitrate, phosphate, and things like this, is actually from mineral deposits in sedimentary rock. And so when old plants and animals died, they would get washed into streams. Those streams would get washed into the ocean, and all of this stuff would settle to the bottom of the ocean and become incorporated into sedimentary rocks. When geological changes bring these rocks to the surface, then landforms are exposed that have various minerals in them. This is where we get coal and oil deposits, but we also get deposits of deposits of nitrate and phosphate. So before Fritz Haber came around, we were limited in our ability of getting access to nitrate by the availability of these above ground mineral deposits. And so you can go around the United States, and there are certain places where there are nitrogen deposits that are close to the surface, and you can see that there are nitrogen mines, nitrate mines. And the regions, the areas right around those mines are basically devoid of plant life, because actually there's too much nitrate in those areas where that nitrate has been exposed by mining. But once Fritz Haber came around, we didn't have to go and mine the limited deposits that we had. We could actually just create it straight out of the air. That vastly increased the amount of ammonium nitrate, and that vastly increased the ability of nations to take that ammonium nitrate and transform it into gunpowder rather than simply using it for fertilizer. So I also mentioned to you that the Murrah Federal Building bombing that occurred back in the 1990s by Tim McVeigh in Oklahoma City. It's sometimes called the Oklahoma City bombing. It's sometimes called the Murrah Federal Building bombing. Was basically a fertilizer bomb that was created from commercially available ammonium nitrate that was taken from a soybean farm in Michigan, and mixing that together with diesel and fuel oil and creating a crude but highly effective bomb. And you guys don't recall that because this happened actually before you were born. But it was, well, it's the largest instance of domestic terrorism on record, and it was just a simple fertilizer bomb. When you go by, when you drive by farms in the spring, you will see these white tanks, usually with green lettering on them, sitting out in farmers' fields, and those are just basically big tanks of ammonium nitrate. And unfortunately, they are far too easy to come by people who want to do bad things with them. So, what started out as a regional conflict in 1914 erupted into a much broader conflict, at least in part because countries had a readily available source of the raw materials that go into making munitions. And so World War I leaves us during this entire period of time from 1900 until the stock market crash of 1929, this ammonium nitrate that is being formed is being used as fertilizer by farmers, and this is leading to productivity increases. And these productivity increases are actually resulting in a surplus of food. And so we talked about the economic plight of farmers, what a good year for farmers means and what a bad year for farmers means in terms of their economics. So prior to the stock market crash of 1929, farmers were already experiencing economic hardship, not because they were having trouble growing crops, but because they were experiencing such high crop surpluses that they couldn't get good prices for their crops simply because of the simple law of supply and demand. Too many crops, too much supply in the face of an inelastic demand for food, and as a result, the price dropped out. What else is happening during this period, the 1920s in the United States? There was a law that prohibited this, and then there was an amendment actually that got rid of this law.
Prohibition of alcohol?
Yeah, the prohibition of alcohol was also happening during this time. Of course, what happens when you prohibit something?
Its use tends to actually increase because of like weird psychological things about the pleasure of doing a prohibited thing.
There's the weird psychological thing of I'm going to do what somebody is telling me not to do. And then there's also just suddenly there's this product that was popular is no longer available. And so people are going to find a way of getting that product. In this case, the product was alcohol. And what was a major source of alcohol during Prohibition times? It's an almost stereotypical source of alcohol during Prohibition. You would put it in a little canning jar.
Moonshine.
Moonshine. Thank you very much, Olivia. Moonshine. What is moonshine?
It's like highly potent alcohol.
And it is made from what?
Corn, I think.
Oh, yes, it is made from corn. And so one of the things that farmers did with this corn surplus that they couldn't sell to the grain buyers at grain elevators and they couldn't sell to food processors, they basically took that corn that was valueless on the corn market, put it in their backyard still, distilled grain alcohol. So what you do is you mash up the corn, all of the sugar and starch that is in the corn then becomes digested by microbes. The byproduct of digesting those energy containing compounds to provide food for the microbes, the byproduct of that is actually alcohol. And then you distill that alcohol off by heating that mash up in a boiler and then running it through a distillation column to condense off the alcohol as it comes off this solution of mash. And so grain alcohol, moonshine, became very popular during Prohibition times because one, it was the only source of alcohol, although an illegal source of alcohol. And it was also a valuable use of a commodity that farmers were having difficulty selling on the market because it was basically in such high surplus, it was essentially worthless. You guys know the relationship between moonshining and NASCAR? Olivia, tell us about the relationship between moonshining and NASCAR.
Isn't it like how they were like racing to like deliver moonshine to people kind of like privately without like government knowing?
Yes, they would be being pursued by the law for illegally trafficking in grain alcohol. And what it did was it bred a group of people, primarily in the South, who became very good at driving on dirt roads in cars that they had souped up, as far as you could soup up a car during that day. And so it bred a bunch of very good amateur racers who eventually morphed themselves into a professional group of racers after Prohibition. And that's kind of where That's the tradition out of which NASCAR grew. So many things about early to middle 20th century history that influence our lives today. NASCAR will not be on the exam, by the way. Moonshine will, but NASCAR will not. So we have this surplus of food being produced by farmers. They can't get good crops, good prices for their crops because they have become too good at producing those crops. And then in 1929, the stock market crashes, the banking system collapses, because when the stock market crashes, everybody wants to pull their money out of the banks. The banks then don't have any money. And so if you didn't get to the bank early to pull your money out, there is no money in there for you. Because of course, one of the things that banks do with money is they loan money to people. And so when you put your money in the bank, it's there, but they may offer a loan to somebody so that they can buy a house. But now the bank has less money than they did because they had to pay some money out to the person who sold the house that was bought by somebody who got a home loan from that bank. And so when you put money into the bank, don't think that your money is just sitting in a little compartment with your name on it, a little box in your name on it, and that money is just always there for you. Banks use money. And so when banks take in money in terms of deposits, and then they loan money out, if somebody comes in and writes a check on their account and, you know, some of the money from their account was taken to be put into a loan, you would just take money from somebody else's account to cover that. And you would just shift money around to satisfy what was being requested by the depositors versus what was being deposited by the depositors, and then what was being lent out by the bank. And that works fine. That's actually how things work today. And nobody has to worry about not going to the bank and not having money there for a variety of reasons. But that becomes a problem when everybody who has deposited money in the bank shows up and says, I want my money. Because I don't trust the stock market. And quite frankly, I don't trust banks now. And so there was a run on banks. Banks collapsed. And it was just, to be crude, it was an economic shit show. And the economic shit show is basically, can be seen most clearly in a graph of the level of the stock market, which I have shown you, which I showed you last time. So this represents, over the course of a couple of years, a precipitous, well, doggone it, why is screen sharing still not working? This shows a precipitous crash in the stock market. And so this was during the Hoover administration. And so one of the responses to Hoover not really responding very well to the depression that came on during the end of his administration, Americans voted him out of office and voted in Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. He took office in March of 1933 and vowed to the American public that in the first 100 days, he would have a series of policies that he would push through Congress that would effectively try and deal with what was then now recognized as a Great Depression. And so FDR gets elected, and this marks the beginning of the New Deal. And so now we've kind of caught up history with where we had kind of jumped forward to. So what can you guys tell me about the New Deal that I haven't already told you?
It creates a lot of jobs programs.
Okay, stop there. Write down any other suggestions that you have. Let's talk about jobs for a few minutes. So during this time, tons of people became unemployed. You guys know what a hobo is? What's your stereotypical image of a hobo?
train hopper with a little like grab sack.
Okay, you see a guy, and he's got a hoe actually. So imagine that this piece of PVC in my office is a hoe, and you see him, and he's got his hoe over his shoulder, and tied to the top of the hoe is a little knapsack with all of his belongings in him. He's basically a migrant farm worker. He's hopping on trains. He's riding the rails to get from one agricultural area to another agricultural area. And this is actually shorthand for hoe boys. These were men primarily who traveled around with the only thing they really needed to work a farm at the time, which was a hoe. And this became shortened over time to hobo. And these were the people who basically were put out of work as a result of the Great Depression and took up migrant farm worker work as a result of this. And so one of the main things that Roosevelt wanted to do was get people back working. And so there were tons of jobs programs. The Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. These were the three main jobs programs. What Roosevelt basically did was he said that private corporations don't have the resources right now to put people to work. And so since we're going to be spending a ton of money, of the government's money, which is also, whenever I say the government is spending money on something, I mean the taxpayers are spending money on something. Let's put them to work basically improving the infrastructure of America. And so the Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration were involved in major projects like dams and highways and bridges and tunnels and things like this. The Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, all of the locks that are up and down the Mississippi River that allows river barge traffic to move goods up and down the Mississippi River. All of these things were put in place during the Depression as a result of the Public Works Administration. The Civilian Conservation Corps, if you've ever been to a national park and you see these beautiful buildings and lodges and things that make up the visitor centers of these national parks, many of those things were built by Civilian Conservation Corps workers. If you go back and look at the 1945 U.S. Geographic Survey maps of the Liberty area, you will see that the place on the northeast portion of campus where they used to have the cross-country track, the cross-country route where they would train, there used to be a Civilian Conservation Corps camp on that land that's notated in those 1945 USGS maps. So the government spent a ton of money digging America out of this depression, and they did it by essentially investing in infrastructure and then employed a ton of people to work on those infrastructure projects, bridges, dams, tunnels, river locks, these kinds of things. So that was one big thing that they did. What else did they do? Well, let's stop and let's just talk about response to depressions and recessions. We went through the Great Recession of 2008. I don't know why they call it the Great Recession, except that it wasn't as much of a depression as the Great Depression was. What do you guys recall of the Great Recession of 2008? You guys were alive during this time period.
Occupy Wall Street.
Okay, so there was that came about after that somewhat, but what was the main thing that happened as a result? What was the main precipitating factor that caused the recession of 2008?
Housing bubble.
Yeah, there was this housing bubble. There was a lot of speculation in the housing market. People were buying houses that were way more expensive than what they were actually worth. They were basically taking out huge loans that they couldn't really pay for. And so through kind of speculation in the housing market, there was all of this overvalued real estate that was being bought by people who were leveraging credit way more than they should have. So I work at William Jewell College. Do you guys have any idea what my salary is? Do you want to know what my salary is? Because I'll tell you.
Sure.
Who's that? Blake. Blake's like, yeah, I want to know what your salary is. $61,000 a year. I've worked here 20 years. I bought a house in 2004, the house that I currently live in, which is a delightful little house down in the historic district. You know what the bank was willing to loan me to buy a house in 2004? I mean, I had what the bank referred to as walk-on water credit at the time, but still, it was obscene. Anybody want to take a guess?
20,000.
Oh no, you can't buy anything for $20,000. They were willing to give me a loan for $350,000. You know what I said?
No.
You're damn right I said no. I'm like, I said, you're crazy. That is an insane amount of money to borrow on a person who makes the salary that I make. That's ridiculous. I'm not that stupid. And I'm not that stupid. I found a house that cost me $102,000 and I have a ton of equity in it and I'll have it paid off before I retire. And I'm not going to do stupid stuff like that. That's what I basically said. So I live in a 1,200 square foot house. It's down in the historic district. It's 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. It satisfies all my needs. It's got a detached garage, which is kind of unusual in the historic district. I love my little house. And what I love about it is that it didn't cost me $350,000. Because if I had bought a house for $350,000 in 2004, in 2009, it would not have been worth $350,000, but I would still hold a loan. I would still hold a mortgage for $350,000. So I would have been what's now referred to as being underwater on your mortgage, where you owe more on your house than what your house is actually worth. This was the major impetus of the major factor that led to that economic decline was so many people buying houses outside of their price range because banks gave them terrible loans, which inflated the housing market, which made some people very rich and basically caused a lot of people to ultimately lose their homes during the recession of 2008. Now, let's step forward. Obama comes into office. What is his solution to this financial crisis? And Congress's solution to this crisis. First 2 years of the Obama administration, he had Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and there was a Democrat in the presidency, and they all got together on a plan to bail out the United States in terms of financial recovery. What did they do?
Bailed the banks.
Oh my God, they bailed the banks out, didn't they? The very people who precipitated the crisis basically got bailed out by the government. Lots of people lost their jobs during this time period, but there wasn't anything in there that was designed to increase employment. Now, employment did increase, but it was a very, very slow slog getting employment back up. but there wasn't any major jobs program associated with that particular recovery. I like Obama. I voted for him twice. I thought this was a colossal mistake of the Obama administration, because rather than bailing out the banks who precipitated the crisis, they could have spent all those trillions of dollars on putting people back to work, and they did not. And they could have put people back to work working on infrastructure projects, which quite frankly, America needs to work on desperately. I ride a bike, I ride across bridges, and so I see up close and personal how bad some of our bridges are here in Missouri. It started to disturb me about 8 years ago when Missouri started putting signs on bridges, and the sign is right at the beginning of the bridge as you go across it, and it's a little sign that says, safe and sound. Like, oh, good, I feel good riding across this bridge because this bridge is safe and sound. But I just rode across 3 other bridges that didn't have safe and sound signs on them. Does that mean they're not safe and sound? One of the routes that I ride regularly was closed because a bridge had developed holes that were so big that they were deemed unsafe. The bridge was deemed unsafe to travel across. I still travel across it because there was just a barricade there and I could bike around it and I could avoid the holes in the bridge. But it isn't that the United States doesn't need infrastructure improvements. All of our municipal sewer systems are very old and leaky. We could have spent a lot of those trillions of dollars on public works, and we chose instead to bail out banks, which I thought was odd. For me, it was a missed opportunity. Roosevelt saw the Depression as an opportunity to put people back to work. What else did the New Deal do? What other programs were in the New Deal? Somebody other than Kenton.
The Farm Security Administration.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Farm Security Administration.
Oh yeah, so
more land stuff.
There was a lot of stuff having to do with farming. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 was one of the first steps involved in dealing with the plight of farmers. And strangely enough, it wasn't a system to increase productivity, it was actually a system to decrease productivity. And so in the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, there was what became known as acreage control. I have it written down so I remember the term from the legislation. Acreage control. What they did was they gave direct payments to farmers to take fields out of production, to basically take fields and let them sit fallow for a time period to basically reduce the glut of food that was on the market in order to raise prices. And so the Agricultural Adjustment Act was largely dealing with price supports. And the way you support price of agricultural commodities is basically by reducing supply, because as we know, what is demand for food? It is it a typical demand curve, or is it a special type of demand curve?
Special type.
It is a special type. What do we call it, Blake?
Inelastic demand.
Yeah, it's an inelastic demand curve. So the only way that you can raise price is by reducing supply, because you can't really do anything about demand. So they pay direct payments to farmers to basically pay them to not farm portions of their land. This reduced food supply, and by 1935, farm income had increased 50%. over what it was in 1932. So the system of price supports and taking acreage out of production seemed to have worked. There was another Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1935. In 1935, it added two programs that they had in place. One of the programs that got set up was the school lunch program. So another way of taking food off of the market is basically to divert it into other markets. And so this is when school lunch programs got set up. So kids would go to school and they would have lunch provided for them at school at a reduced price. This is also when what's now known as the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, came into being. It wasn't called that at the time, but this idea that some of the American food supply could be diverted into supporting nutrition programs for children from low-income families. That was part of the 1935 Agricultural Adjustment Act. All of this was essentially paid for by taxes on food processors. And this was challenged in court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was deemed by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional because you were basically taxing food processors and then returning that money to the people who were providing the food to the food processors for processing. And I'm not sure of the intricacies of why that argument was unconstitutional at the time. But anyway, both of these laws were struck down. And so there was another Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1938 that basically removed those unconstitutional provisions. And let's see, what else am I trying to think of? Oh yeah, and the 1938 bill also set up what came to be known as the ever normal granary. So Poland talks about the ever normal granary. Do you recall this from the Omnivore's Dilemma? It's in the section of the book where they talk about Earl Butz, Nixon's agriculture secretary. It's on page 49 of the Omnivore's Dilemma. Do you guys hate that I can just pick up the Omnivore's Dilemma and like in under a minute find the page that I'm looking for? You guys found it yet? This is in a chapter you were supposed to have read. Still in chapter 2. I know you guys are probably thinking, why did he make us buy this book if we're going to spend all of our time in chapter 1 and chapter 2? Nobody? Don't leave me hanging here.
What are we looking for again?
Ever normal granary, what is it?
So wasn't it like if it was a weak market for like storable crops, they could either sell it, like the farmers had the choice to sell it, or they could take out a loan with the government using their crops as collateral?
Okay, so you've almost got it correct. So how does a farmer, even today, how does a farmer get money for next year's crop? So it's the end of the season. It's fall. I've brought in my harvest. I've sold all of that stuff. I can pay back loans that I have from this past year and maybe sock a little bit of money away, but then I don't have any money to fund next year's activities. So what do? Mary?
Take out a loan.
You take out a loan. And what do you use as collateral for that loan?
Your crops.
You use next year's crop. So I'm going to get a loan so I can plant next year's crop, and my collateral for that loan is next year's crop. Why do you not want your farm to be the collateral for that loan?
Because if you can't pay it back, then you're lost your farm.
Then you've lost your farm, and that's not so good, is it? So in 1933, there was a separate set of legislation called the Commodity Credit. What was the last C stand for? Commodity Credit Corporation. Of course, I don't like corporations, so I don't pay attention to the corporation part of it. The CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, was also set up in 1933, and this was an organization that would make loans to farmers. And those loans to farmers would be basically made to allow them to essentially plant the next year's crops. And so what would happen is, I'm going to erase, you guys have the timeline down so far? All right, I'm going to erase the timeline. So this is a supply and demand curve for food, an inelastic demand curve for food, such that the only thing that affects the price of food is the supply curve. So what a farmer would do is would take out a loan for the following year's planting and basically fund getting up and running in the spring, and the commodity for, or the collateral for that loan was the crop itself. And so what would happen is, if it was a good year, supply went up. But as a result of supply going up, supply increasing, as a result of supply increasing, what happens to price?
Goes down.
The price goes down. So now the farmer has all this corn that he can sell at a really, really low price, and as a result, not make much money off of because it's such a low price. Or so he could sell it on the open market, or he could basically just let the lender take that crop from him as repayment of the loan. And so this is an agriculturally good year from the standpoint of productivity, but as a result of all that productivity, it's actually a terrible year. So what would happen under this case is exactly what Mary said. You have the choice of selling your grain on the open market, or you could basically use the grain to repay the lender. Well, who is the lender in this case? The lender is the federal government. The federal government gave you a loan to support your farm, and you have to repay that loan either by repaying the loan in cash or repaying the loan in collateral. And what they would do is the government would basically have bought that grain through this loan program, and they would take that grain and they would store it. And they would store it in these big grain elevators that you see throughout the Midwest. In some cases, those grain elevators are managed by co-ops, but in most of those cases, those granaries were basically built during the Depression era as a part of this program. The act of the government taking that grain off of the farmer's hands essentially reduced the supply during that year and bolstered prices. And so this was one form of price control, the government taking the grain off the farmers' hands in the form of payment back of these loans, so that they controlled supply in order to stabilize prices at some set level. Now, let's say that we have a couple of years that are good in terms of productivity, and all of a sudden we hit a year when there's a drought or something in the Midwest and supply goes down, the supply curve moves to the left. What happens to price?
It goes up.
Price goes up. This is good for farmers potentially because they have higher prices for their products. It's not so good for farmers because, of course, they have fewer products to sell. But who else is this bad for? Especially during a depression when you don't have a job and don't have any money.
The consumers.
It's bad for consumers. So high food prices take people who are already struggling financially and just make life harder on them. But of course, what is the government sitting on?
The grain that they stored from past years.
They're sitting on all this grain that they stored from past years. So they can release that grain onto the market. It increases the supply, reduces the cost to the American public, and it doesn't really do anything for farmers, except that once again, if they can sell all of their grain at whatever prices they're getting it for. And so during those years, it kind of left them hanging, and they either survived and had enough grain at the increased prices that it kept them around until the following year. But of course, the following year, they're just basically going to get another loan from the government to start that next year's planting anyway. So over time, the government stored up a lot of excess crop production. And in the process of this, during good years, they were able to take that crop off the market, therefore raising prices so that farmers could get a decent price for their grain. And during times when agricultural productivity went down, they could release that grain onto the market and lower prices for the American consumer. They did this through the structure of the Commodity Credit Corporation. And this was kind of how farms operated financially, really until the early 1970s, when all of these systems changed because of actions taken by the Nixon administration. Let's see, what else do I want to say about these things? So there was a big chunk of the New Deal that was actually focused on agriculture. And so one of the reasons that I want to talk about the New Deal is because of these ways of essentially doing two things: ensuring an adequate amount of food to the American public. So ensuring that productivity is high enough that everybody gets fed, but at the same time, avoiding overproduction so that farmers can actually make a living. And so it was kind of dancing on this tightrope of you want enough production so everybody gets enough food, but you don't want so much production that farmers can't make a living and be around to farm next year. And that's what they attempted to do by manipulating the amount of acres that were planted through acreage control programs and subsidizing farmers directly for taking acreage out of production. And then things like the abnormal granary that kind of moderated temporal fluctuations in productivity in terms of the effect that those fluctuations have on price. So at the beginning of all of this, so keep in mind that the ever normal granary wasn't set up until 1938. What happened between 1933 and 1938 that affected agricultural productivity a lot. Keep in mind that in 1933, a big focus of the Agricultural Adjustment Act was actually price control that was brought about by production control. And when I say production control, I mean taking acreage out of production. What happened between 1932 and 1938? It ended up being kind of catastrophically bad. Can you guys see the screen?
The outbreak of World War II.
No, World War II didn't come until 1939. What happened between 33 and 38? It's on the screen. Can you guys see the screen?
Dust Bowl.
Thank you very much. The Dust Bowl. So at a time when the Roosevelt administration is trying to get farmers to take acreage out of production in order to bolster farm prices, the price of commodities, they had no way of knowing when they proposed that legislation and put those systems in place that they were doing that right before a multi-year drought in the Midwest. The multi-year drought in the Midwest basically wrecked agricultural productivity in the United States right on the heels of encouraging farmers to take a lot of their land out of production. So what happens to supply at that point? Supply of corn, soybeans, whatever.
It goes down.
It goes way down. Prices go way up at the same time that people are struggling through a Great Depression, which is why in 1938, after these two Agricultural Adjustment Acts of 1933 and 1935 were struck down as unconstitutional, the 1938 didn't just deal with price controls, it also dealt with supply issues. How can we stabilize prices while also ensuring adequate production so that we don't hit a situation like we had during the Dust Bowl, where we had been encouraging farmers to reduce production for a couple of years, and then right after that we get a multi-year drought that wipes out production. Production goes way down, prices go way up at a time when it was the worst possible time for prices to be going up on people. So the agricultural policies of the New Deal changed and morphed over the course of the time period between when Roosevelt was elected and when World War II began. But those were largely responses early on to the previous couple of decades of really low commodity prices for farmers. And then the 38 bill was a response to essentially the Great Depression combined with the Dust Bowl years in the Midwest. And so all three of these acts were responses to the economic plight of farmers and the economic plight of Americans. But the unfortunate thing about Congress is Congress doesn't ever move very fast on anything because that's kind of the nature of collective decision making. But once again, the provisions in the 1938 Agricultural Adjustment Act were basically then how farming was funded until 1973. So these were very long-lasting agricultural programs. Another program that was set up during this time is the Soil Conservation Service. The Soil Conservation Service was a service that was designed to have government scientists go out and work with farmers to adopt farming methods that would conserve topsoil This is something that came about before the Dust Bowl was an issue, but after the Dust Bowl occurred, there was a lot more requests by farmers for soil conservation service activity on their farms after the Dust Bowl because of the effect of this multi-year drought and the lost productivity from the loss of topsoil. So that was something that was put in place once again back in 1933, but became more important later. And the Soil Conservation Service is still with us today. What other kinds of non-farm things that we still have around today are a result of actions that were taken in Roosevelt's time? Can you think of any of these New Deal programs that are still around?
Social Security.
Social Security, thank you very much. Tell us what you know about Social Security.
It's like a welfare program that financially supports people into retirement, or at least it was when it had funding.
Yeah, don't think of it as a welfare program because you pay for it. You put money into it so that in later years you can take money out of it, which is not how I would define welfare. Who was that?
Kenton.
Oh, Kenton. So you think of Social Security as a welfare program?
I mean, I guess I use that term. I don't know. I wasn't using it too strictly.
Okay. Have you heard the term entitlement?
Sure.
Yeah. So you oftentimes see politicians refer to entitlement programs, and the main entitlement program that they're talking about is Social Security in many cases. Why is it called an entitlement program? And some politicians actually use this term entitlement as a derogatory term. Why do they call it an entitlement program? Can entitlement be bad?
I think in the way you use the word entitlement, it can be both good and bad.
Okay, that's Mackenzie, right?
Yes.
Give me an example of a bad form of the word entitlement, a bad usage of the and a usage of the word that that implies that it's bad. And you can use a white male professor as your example if you wish.
I think excuse me, the biggest form, like the most negative form, is like a lot of people say people like rich kids or something like that are entitled, like they feel like they have everything. But then if you're speaking on like Social Security wise, there's people that are entitled to that money due to being retired, or if a significant other passes away, like they are entitled to that money in a good way.
Okay, so I could say, I'm a white male in the United States. I'm entitled to be a professor at a college and make all this money that they pay professors, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I would be kind of a not very nice person if I was saying that, but that's a negative form of entitlement. The second thing that you're talking about, though, is actually why these things are referred to as entitlement programs. And Social Security is an entitlement program because you spend your entire working life paying into the system so that when you retire, it will pay out to you. And so in that way, you are entitled to that money because you put that money in at the beginning. It seems like you should be entitled to take that money out at the end. Prior to Social Security being set up, how did most people get funded for retirement? Think back to the 1920s if you can. 1910s, 1900. Well, it's 10:04. Don't think about that. Think about that between now and Monday, because what's happening on Friday?
Presentation.
Presentations. How are those going?
Good.
You don't sound positive about that, Blake.
Still got some work to do.
Okay. All right. If you guys have any problems with that or any questions about that, definitely either contact me via email, set up a Zoom meeting, or come by my office. Tomorrow I have advising meetings a good chunk of the day, but drop me a line and I'll see if I have some free space. If you have any questions or problems with that. What we'll do on Friday is you guys will have the ability to share your screens. Like I said before, probably no more than a 10-minute presentation. Don't make it too text heavy, because text heavy presentations just put people to sleep. Everybody needs to share equally in the presentation, so it should just be a one-person show. And do your best to make the findings from the genetically engineered organism chapters as approachable and accessible to your peers as you possibly can. Questions about that? All right, we'll take up New Deal stuff on Monday then.